Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
Today on Everyday Injustice, we have Angie Gordon. Angie is incarcerated and a transgender individual. Welcome to the show, Angie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's really interesting, and I was just reading this. A Department of Justice study found that nationally, trans individuals report having been victims of sexual assault while incarcerated at a rate 10 times higher than non-trans prisoners. And of course, you know, there's a general problem of sexual assault in prison, and it seems like it's even higher for trans individuals. What is your experience with this? Have you had these kinds of problems?
Yeah, so I've been in CDCR for the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation for about 15 years, and during that time down, I have experienced victimization, both physical abuse and sexual victimization.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And I've seen a lot of it play out with those in my community. So it is a real problem in here.
And tell us a bit about your background. How did you get into CDCR in the first place?
How did I come to prison?
Yeah.
So I had a lot of issues. I grew up in Napa, California, and fairly closeted, both in my gender identity and sexuality. And I had a lot of issues growing up managing that through substance abuse. And my substance abuse issues, and really a lot of issues that I had in my relationships and my peer relationships and my coping skills kind of metastasized into a pattern of violence, interpersonal violence. And so in 2009, I came to prison for the commission of multiple violent felonies, and I was given a 48-year to life sentence. So that's kind of how I came to prison.
And is it okay to ask you about your transition? Because I know for a lot of people that's a very personal issue.
No, I think that I'm a totally open book, and where for some people it's really personal, I want to be transparent as possible because I think there's a lot of misconceptions about my community, and I want to be as helpful as I can to try and alleviate some of those confusions. So it's fine.
And can you talk about when you began your transition?
Yeah, I started my transition in 2011, my social transition, and then in 2015, I started a medical transition.
And how did you know that you were trans or that you had gender identity issues?
That's such an interesting question, right? Do you know you are anything? Yeah, no, I think when I got to prison, I was exposed to a totally different environment, and the restrictions that were kind of placed on me in the outside world were alleviated in a lot of ways. And I was also exposed to the trans community in here in a way that I hadn't ever been before. And so I was able to kind of begin to understand myself in a different way and place my experiences in a different frame. And that informed my ability to transition and kind of become me and knowing who I was through a transgendered lens. But I'm kind of resistant to the idea that there's some essential trans person lurking within us. And I think there's a tendency for people to transition and then retrospectively apply their trans experience to their early childhood when they may or may not have had those feelings then, or been able to understand those feelings or realize them. But I think there's kind of an expectation in popular culture that trans people fit themselves into that normal frame, right? Like, oh, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, and when I was a little kid, I played with dolls and wanted to wear dresses, and that's just not always the case. Sometimes people grow up in environments where they lack the ability to understand themselves in that way. And so for me, coming to prison, being exposed to a different frame of experience enabled me to realize myself in that way. And that really began in 2010, 2011. Does that, I know it's a little convoluted, but does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. And hopefully I'm not being too awkward in my questions because,
No, not at all.
Did being incarcerated influence your decision to begin your transition?
Absolutely. The trans community and the LGBTQ community is fairly well represented in prison. There's a lot of disparagement in our community being disproportionately exposed to the criminal justice system. So there is a pretty strong queer community in here. And that peer support and shared experience was a huge influence in allowing me to understand myself in that way. But then also the being incarcerated with a life sentence and separated from all of the normative restrictions of life on the outside in a certain way liberated me to reconstruct who I was in a way that was more authentic. So yeah, absolutely.
And can you talk about what it's been like to be incarcerated? And you're in a men's prison, right?
I am. I'm in a male-designated correctional facility. And
so how has that been for you as a trans woman?
It's a difficult environment, right? This environment's pretty hyper-masculine, and it's pretty sexist. And, with hyper-masculinity comes, a lot of homophobia and transphobia. And so there's been a lot of adverse social experiences. But in the same scope, there's also been a lot of really rewarding social experiences. I've had an opportunity to develop relationships with men in here that I may not have been able to develop on the streets because the lack of women in this environment kind of makes them a little bit more receptive to interact with me and to accept my femininity in a way that on the streets they might have been less inclined to do. And so I've developed a lot of friendships and a lot of close relationships that may or may not have been able to occur in the same way on the street.
Now, did you choose to remain in a male prison, or has that been imposed on you?
Well, at one point it was imposed. And then a new law was passed. The Transgender Respect Agency and Dignity Act went into effect in January of 2021. And that sort of opened the door for preoperative and postoperative trans women or trans men to be assigned to facilities based on their gender identity and their personal preference rather than the strict sex segregation or anatomical segregation that was going on before. And so not only have I decided not to transfer to a women's facility, but in August I had gender reassignment surgery. So I had, bottom and top surgery, and I elected to stay after that.
Now, let me ask you this, because I know this is a controversial issue, and I know enough about you to know that you won't shy away from it. But, I think the issue of transgender placement, I think, cuts across some interesting lines, in my opinion, because you have, on the one hand, progressive people that normally support LGBTQ issues, but are concerned with safety issues for women in a women's prison being exposed to people with male genitalia. And on the other hand, we have the stats that we cited at the beginning of this show, which show that transgender people are subject to much higher levels of sexual violence than non-transgender people. So can you kind of walk us through this fine line? Because I can kind of see both sides of the issue on this one.
No, for sure. I want to say from the gate that the perception or the fear, right, that I think cis women experience in women's facilities about the idea that I think that the fear that cis women express concerning preoperative trans women coming into women's facilities is totally legitimate to acknowledge and to respect and to be empathetic and cautious of, right? Because the department is a giant administrative bureaucratic machine that makes mistakes and things fall through the crack. And so for people who have had experience in this environment, being at where safety has not always been a top priority, in practice, and I think that it's totally legitimate to have fear and trepidation about that. And so I really am empathetic to cis women and their concern about trans women coming. I also recognize that transphobia is a thing, and sometimes trans women get shifted into a harmful and biased trope, which tries to attach masculine aggressiveness to them as a way to delegitimize their femininity and gender identity. And so there's this fine line between empathizing with a legitimate symbolic fear, even if that fear may not be attached to a real threat, but then also having to flesh out when that fear is being disingenuously promoted as a way to further a transphobic position, right? And I think for trans women who consider going to a women's facility, they have to flesh that out for themselves. So for me, I choose not to go because I feel safe here and because I don't want to be responsible for causing cis women to feel uncomfortable in a place where their safety and their comfort is already so heavily compromised. But for other trans women who have experienced significantly more abuse than I have in prison, or who don't have the skill set that I have to avoid it, I think it's totally legitimate for them to go so as to get away from, the dangerous environment that can occur here. Does that kind of make sense, or do you have a follow up there?
No, I
think
think
it's a complicated issue. I feel like say it in one bite is difficult.
No, I think you did a really good job with that because you were able to kind of parse both sides of the story, which I think is really important because I think if you disregard one side, then, and overlook concerns and fears, for me, the problem is not about cis or trans. It's about safety in prison and the fact that there just isn't enough safety for the people that are incarcerated.
No, I agree. And I think that the department needs to evolve in the way that they think about safety, because their understandings or the strategies that they use to promote safety are fairly antiquated, and they don't look like when you think about violence in men's prisons specifically, a lot of times I think the image is that there's just this dangerous criminal lurking in the bushes with like a candy bar on a string waiting to pounce on some, doe-like victim as they walk by. And that's just not how it happens. The environment is set up in a way where relationships form that are exploitative, and the deprivations of prison escalate the extent to which individuals see benefit and profit at the expense of other people. And so trans women represent a commodity, and there's a lot of guys in here who want to exploit that commodity because they're struggling with the deprivations of prison. And so then in turn, the victimization occurs in an interpersonal dynamic where the people who are perpetrating these harms have a personal relationship with the victim. And so me knowing that, I navigate my environment in a way where I set up boundaries. I clearly identify individuals who may not have the best motives, and then I work to not place myself in compromising situations. But the department doesn't get that. The department doesn't provide resources for people to avoid dangerous situations. They just use this mentality, which is like, oh, we'll just move you to a safer location, even though every location is premised upon those same social rules. So, there's a disconnect between what promotes real safety and then what the department claims is safety. And I think there's also an issue with, there's a misrepresentation of numbers that correspond to safety, because like with PREA, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, it criminalizes all sex in prison. So even sex that is quote unquote consensual is still recorded as a prison rape violation, right? Because you can't legally give consent in prison. And so the misrepresentation of those numbers, sometimes it creates a problem that is not necessarily there in the full scope that it's represented, or it's represented in a way which doesn't deal with the nuance of interpersonal dynamics that play out here.
Yeah, and I want to bring in one other aspect here, which is a cultural expectation aspect. And I was reading this book where these American correctional people had gone to Europe, and they toured these facilities in Germany and Sweden and Norway. And the total setup is completely different. Like, people that are locked up there are often in dorms. They can leave during the day, and it's much more normal to a normal person's life. And there was this interesting exchange between the tour guide and the guard from America notices that in the kitchen they have forks and knives like you would have in a normal kitchen. And he goes, hey, hasn't anyone taken those knives and stabbed people? And the person from Europe looked at him like he was crazy. He's like, why would somebody do that? And, it makes you think, right? Because the incarcerated people in their everyday lives, if they're at their home, they don't pick up a knife and stab somebody, even if they're messed up. It's only in the prison setting that they have that expectation that this is okay behavior. And it seems like if we change the expectations, safety would follow.
Yeah, well, and it's the conditions. I mean, and this is something I always look at, because I started on a level 4 maximum security yard where there was rampant violence and people were locked in their cells almost, they'd come out of their cell maybe 3 hours a day. And then now I'm in an environment where the doors are open and we have free movement all the time. And it's a much less volatile, hostile, and violent environment. And so CDCR would tell you that they would say, oh, well, it's because of the people that are there. On level 4 yards, there's dangerous people, but on level 2 yards, there's less dangerous people. But if you stop and take a step back, you say, well, wait a minute. When people feel less caged, less treated like animals, and there's less deprivation, is there less conflict and less motivation to fight over scarce resources? Part of a huge issue in prison that relates to safety is drugs. People are lonely, and drugs are a way to cope with the difficulties of prison. but drugs are illegal. So they introduce drugs illegally to the institution, but then they have to police that economy. And the only way to police that economy is through gang violence and, the black market. And that environment produces harm. It increases the likelihood that people will make shivs and weapons so as to enforce economic rules. But if you take away the economic deprivation, you don't need that violence in the same way. And so the Norway model, where people are humanized and they have greater freedom, it alleviates the strains that force conflict. And so, it really speaks to the way that the American prison system is a little bit backwards in its understanding of safety and violence. But there's also there's an important aspect of prison in America which capitalizes and economizes violence. They create conditions which promote violence and harm, and then they use the symbolism of that violence and harm to argue that prisons are necessary. So it's like the harms that are produced here become the narrative that justifies the system which produces the harm. It's a cycle of insanity that we pay a pretty penny for, all at the expense of not providing care to people before they come to prison and the trauma-informed realities that lead here.
Listening to you talk, it's pretty remarkable because you sound like you could be a college professor with that level of sophistication. And yet, when you arrived in prison, you were almost 40 years old and you were a high school dropout, and it's only been incarcerated that you've pursued your education.
Yeah, I was 23 when I came to prison. I'm 40 now, 39. And I was a high school dropout. And education became a really important aspect of me kind of finding who I was and being a transformative opportunity for me. But it's not just the education, because it's also relationships that were formed because of education. Dr. Joan Parkin, she's involved with Davis Vanguard, and she's the director of the Vanguard Incarcerated Press. She was my professor in 2015, and I'd almost given up on writing, and I came into an English course with her, and she pulled me to the side after she read an essay, and she said, you need to take this more seriously. You have talent. You need to do something with yourself. And we formed a relationship, and she mentored me and inspired me to take myself more seriously and take my talents more seriously and devote myself to education. And that led me down a path towards getting more engaged in academia, and then reaching out to another really important person in my life, Dr. Emily Lenning, who's a queer criminologist at Fayetteville State University in North Carolina. And my relationship with her and her mentorship of me and her investment in my life, again, pushed me to another level where I was able to invest in myself, and I was able to move my work and my understanding of my environment to the next level. And so if it hadn't have been for the investment of those two women, and of course my family supporting me throughout my entire incarceration, I never would have reached this position, right? And so but those things are not provided to incarcerated people. I was just really lucky and riding off the laurels of my sustained privilege that gave me those opportunities. And, so it's not that I came to prison and I made a personal transformation and ergo prison works. It's because I came to prison, and in spite of the way that prison dehumanizes and breaks people down, I was lucky enough to meet two compassionate and invested women who took the time to build me up and rehumanize me in spite of my environment. And it's because of them and because of my connection to members in the community that I was able to get here. And so that's just a really important distinction to make. I couldn't talk about it without acknowledging them and their contributions to my life.
So we're talking with Angie Gordon. Angie, I wanted to kind of close on this note because I feel like one of the most important aspects of the carceral system is that we completely fail most of the time, the incarcerated people, because we don't educate them. We don't give them a way out. In fact, we make it hard for people to succeed when they get out because they're still restricted. And so here you are, and you're serving a life sentence, and maybe there's a chance that you will get out at some point, but you've accomplished a lot while incarcerated.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to, my accomplishments, I can't look at my accomplishments without also acknowledging the privilege which produced them, right? I'm white. I have a supportive family who has afforded me, financial resources throughout the time that I've been incarcerated. And that has privileged me in a number of ways. I haven't had to resort to survival tactics to survive prison. Economically, I've been able to take the time and not have a job or not have to hustle on the yard to pursue education. And I avoid a lot of harsh treatment from custody staff because trans women of color have a lot harder time in prison than I do. The sad reality is that race is a criminalizing feature in the eyes of the authority figures. I can't talk about my accomplishments outside of that, but yeah, I have managed to accomplish a lot. I conducted a study in 2022 at a California prison and had the results of that study published in Critical Criminology, an academic journal. And that's a pretty big accomplishment. But again, it wouldn't have been possible without, Dr. Parkin and Dr. Lenning taking an investment in me and helping lift me up and cultivate my talent.
So as we wrap up here, maybe let's go back to the issue of trans people incarcerated. I mean, from your perspective, what do you think people should know about the trans community in prison, and how can people learn maybe more about it so that they can overcome some of their trepidations?
I think the first thing is empathy, right? And that's the answer for everything. We have to be empathetic to other people's experiences. And for people that are on the inside and for people that are looking in from the outside, the trans community is embattled. And sometimes the behavior and the mentalities that form within that embattled reality are not pretty. Harm begets harm. And when you are in an environment where your identity is challenged casually, it's disrespected casually, and you're frequently targeted by social hostility, people break and they snap and they react negatively. And then so often those negative reactions are used as a characterizing interpretation to say, see, this is how those people are. This is why those people can't be trusted. This is why those people are all crazy. And I think that unempathetic characterization does a major disservice. And so when we recognize that not just for the trans community, but especially with the trans community, harm is at the source of our social problems. And the only response to harm that we should ever muster is care. And it's not about making distinctions between illegal and legal. It's all about recognizing that harm occurs, trauma occurs, and it replicates itself. And the only response that we should have should be the administration of care. And it should be equitable care, and it should be empathetic care. And that's the only way that we can move forward together. And so for the trans community, the experiences that they have before and while in prison are difficult, and that makes them a complicated population. But when you take a step back and you recognize that those complications are the product of trauma and abuse, it's important for us to understand that we contribute to that trauma and abuse when we fail to apply an empathetic lens and apply the care that's needed.
We've been talking with Angie Gordon. Angie is a trans woman incarcerated at CDCR. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and being so open to discussing some difficult issues.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
This has been Everyday Injustice. I'm your host, David Greenwald. Join us again next time for more tales from the injustice system.